So when I spoke earlier about the opening of our liturgy, I skipped Kol Nidre itself. And Kol Nidre's power as prayer is really mostly the melody, right? The text itself is a legal formula, declaring in advance that whatever promises we may make during the coming year won't technically constitute vows. But it points to a very specific tragic gap between what we say and what we do. God omer ve'oseh, God says and does, right? Simultaneously, consistently, in one act. We express a lot of good intentions that we don't fulfill. But even more broadly, Kol Nidre invites us to examine our relationship to speech, how we use and misuse words. I don't know if you noticed how many of the 44 al-Chetz that we confess to relate to speech. 9 of them, 9 out of 44 explicitly about speech, and then a few others that are committed through speech, like denial and deceit or condescension. So why this emphasis on language? Jewish tradition understands words to be very powerful actions, right? The entire creation was brought about through divine speech. God said, let there be light, and there's light. Our words, too, create and shape reality. There are some commentators who understand that when the Torah says that the human is B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of God, that means the power of speech. That's what's godly about us. So it's just words is one of the most un-Jewish sentences ever spoken, right? I can't stress that enough. We could do a year-long course on Jewish texts on speech. There is so much to say about what we say, right? I will barely scratch the surface tonight, but it's important this year. Because first of all, we are seeing big time the devastating power of misused speech. Lies are told intentionally about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, and suddenly there are bomb threats and schools have to be closed. And an entire community is targeted and terrified. Lies are told intentionally about FEMA and its hurricane response, including 33 demonstrably false viral posts on X, of which 10 were explicitly anti-Semitic. Those 10 garnered 17.1 million views. And suddenly the governor of North Carolina is pleading for the lies to stop because the words are creating conditions that interfere with the actual distribution of aid. Bullying and hate speech in school. Anti-trans, anti-immigrant, anti-Semitic, and make no mistake, they usually all come together, or just general verbal cruelty, contributes to a mental health crisis among our children and too often to suicide, right? And on and on. Now again, I am not making false equivalencies, right? There is a big difference between intentionally, shamelessly lying about FEMA or Haitians or election integrity or countless other things for political and financial gain, and the ways that most of us misuse speech, misspeak, occasionally tell falsehoods. The worst offenders actually know about this distinction and exploit this. I never thought I would be citing this on Kol Nidre, but guess what? Mein Kampf talks about the big lie, which has credibility precisely because most people are only comfortable telling small lies and would never tell big lies. So they can't believe that anyone else, this is direct quote, could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously, even though the facts which prove this to be so may be brought clearly to their minds. They will still doubt and waver and will continue to think that there may be some other explanation. If you look at the last line of the Kotzker Rebbe's broken heart teaching, we'll come back to it tomorrow, that we looked at on Rosh Hashanah, his last line is, nothing is as crooked as a straight falsehood. Enough said. But there is inevitably a gap between what we say and who we are, between our words and our deeds for sure, and also the gap between our words and our hearts, what we're able and unable to put into words, the things we say that aren't really what we feel or believe, the things we believe that we don't have the courage to say. The gap between our words and the truth, because of error or ignorance about ourselves, or error or ignorance about the facts, untruths we perpetrate due to self-interest, or lies we pass on because we don't take the time to verify. The falsehoods we tell because the truth is too hard to own. We all sometimes engage in hurtful speech, words that hurt because they're said or withheld, expressions of gratitude, support, and love, silence when we should have spoken up, what we say and don't say in order to fit in and get along. Sometimes the stories we choose to tell and how we tell them are damaging. Narratives about our world or our personal situations that keep us stuck, powerless, angry, fearful, hopeless. And I'll include here unhelpful inner narratives, not necessarily said aloud, just to ourselves. When we make an honest mistake, how many of us have an inner voice that says, oh, I'm such an idiot? Now, it may seem like a trivial example, but if I tell myself over and over that making a mistake makes me an idiot, it becomes harder and harder to admit I made a mistake. I left us on Rosh Hashanah with two big questions. How can I get better at standing in the tragic gap between who I want to be and the reality of who I am? And knowing that if I give my heart to anyone or anything, it will one day break. What can I do to help my heart break open instead of shattering apart? The words we use play a big role in both those things. And not just avoiding negative speech. It's at least as much about using speech in positive, creative, healing ways. For example, when we take the risk of articulating aloud more of what's in our hearts, what we're struggling with, what we're unsure of, what we're embarrassed about, what we're hurt by, usually we discover we're not alone. When I was interim dean at JTS for the rabbinical school, I really wanted to work on the culture. And so one of the things I did was I did anonymous surveys with the students. And I knew that there was a lot of underground stuff, a lot of things that students weren't feeling free to talk about in their relationship to halakha. So I did this survey anonymously, and we looked at the results in real time. And it asked students, like, what was applicable to them about how they felt about halakha. It's holy, it gets in my way, I feel it comes from God, I feel it's like a whole range of things. We did the survey. And you know what happened afterwards when they saw the result? And I asked them, like, what do you think? How did that feel? There was this outpouring, student after student. I thought I was the only one. It turns out I'm the majority, right? I thought I was the only one who had trouble with this. It turns out, like, we all have trouble with this. This is what happens when we take that risk. We are so afraid sometimes of being judged and found wanting. Speaking what's true for us is how we build real community and deep friendships. And it's how we connect across difference. And actually, like all tragic gaps, the gap between what we say and what's in our hearts can be very generative. There's a phrase in rabbinic literature, let your ears hear what your mouth is saying, right? It's used usually to point out logical contradiction, right? Listen to yourself, right? You said this, you do, right? And sometimes, though, it's used as a way to teach. Pay attention to what our mouths are saying in Torah study, in prayer. Think about the implications for our own behavior, right? What are we doing when we pray these words? Are we affirming that everything in here we think is true, right? This book doesn't describe the world as it is. I had a student once who said, when I pray, it's like I'm casting my vote for this vision. Right? I hear my own voice, my own mouth articulate this. And I say, yes, this is what I want. It's one of the reasons that confession on Yom Kippur must be made aloud. You can't just think it. You have to say it in words, because speech can be a way of engaging the will, transferring something from a vague idea to real awareness, to active commitment. In other words, sometimes our mouths can educate our hearts, helping teach them to break open instead of apart. I'll give you 3 examples before we close. When we have the courage to say out loud more of what's really true for us, what we suffer with, what we treasure, not only do we find we're not alone and we better connect with others, it can actually help us become more resilient and more empathic. Once I've owned aloud, for example, that I feel lonely, it's easier to be present to someone else's loneliness. It's when I can't admit it, when I can't say it, that I want to turn away. Or we encounter someone who disagrees with us completely on something important. Maybe, but not only politics. And maybe our first thought is, oh, this person is ignorant or stupid or immoral or a lost cause. But what if we pause, and trust me, I've tried this, what if we pause and we push ourselves to articulate in words to that person, I'm curious what leads you to think that way? Would you be open to sharing? We may find that our own genuine curiosity actually follows. The mere act of saying, I'm curious, and of asking instead of arguing, right? Provided we do it as a real question, not a sneering condemnation, right? We have to really ask, right? That naming I'm curious shifts and opens something in us. And sometimes, not always, a good conversation and discovery of some things we share may actually follow. Here's the last one. Did you know that when you're feeling a difficult emotion, and who isn't these days, if you try to fight it, make it go away, you actually cause more stress chemicals to be released in your body. So, for example, telling ourselves to stop being angry or anxious is often counterproductive. Speaking to oneself in compassionate ways often works much better. Here are a couple of suggestions from Professor Kristen Neff of the University of Texas at Austin of what we might say. It's normal and important to experience setbacks and make mistakes. I can be gentle with myself here. Big difference from, oh, such an idiot. Here's another one. There are many people in the world who are suffering in the same way I am right now. We are all deserving of love and peace. Right? You say that to yourself. All three examples are ways to use language to help our hearts grow bigger, softer, more loving. And that's just a fingernail scratch into the enormous power of speech. It is so easy to feel helpless these days. The problems are huge. And it's hard not to feel I'm too small to make a difference. But taking care in what we say and how we say it is genuinely impactful. It affects us for sure, educating our hearts so they'll more likely break open instead of apart, allowing us to live with more joy, more resilience. But it's not only about us. The changes in us and in everyone we talk to have ripple effects outward. Speech shapes and creates worlds. Let's speak in life-giving ways. We'll rise now, please, in body and or spirit for Aleinu, page 246.